The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for joining us on another episode of Voices in Validation. I'm happy to welcome back one of my past guests, Valarie King-Bailey. She's the CEO of Onshore Technology Group. Thank you so much for being with me again, Valarie. It is great to have you back.
It's great to be back, Stacey. How are you today?
I am well. I hope that you are very well too.
Indeed, I am.
Excellent. So I wanted to chat with you. As you know, pharmaceutical industry has been kind of slowly making its way into the next, what they're calling industrial revolution, or some refer to it as Pharma 4.0. And with that comes, AI and the Internet of Things and big data and a lot more terms that we're hearing more and more. Can you highlight some of the current trends specific to computer systems validation? I know you are an expert in automation and computer systems validation, and I'm just hoping you can lend some light to this subject.
Yes, Stacey, and this is a great question to start us off with. The elephant in the room for validation these days is cybersecurity. It's changing the way that we validate computer systems. Cybersecurity really requires us to look at a system's readiness for validation, not only in terms of the testing of the system from the installation, operational, or performance qualification, but it also requires us to look at it from a cybersecurity qualification. How ready are we to be able to deal with cyber threats? It's a whole new dimension that is added to the readiness of systems. If you think about when we validate systems, what are we actually doing? We're confirming that this software is ready for production use according to the intended use of the company. Well, you really can't say that a system is ready for production use if it is vulnerable to cybersecurity threats. So cybersecurity is really changing the way we look at things. Now, you mentioned a couple of things, Stacey, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, big data. Right. I would even throw in there robotics. I'm working on a robotics process automation validation exercise for one of my clients. Robotics and Internet of Things, IoT, cloud, mobility, all of these things are changing the way we validate systems. And why is that? Because the cloud and mobility and robotics really changed the paradigm of how we validate computer systems. Let's go back to the old days in the 1980s when things were grand and we were validating systems back then. When we looked at validating systems, it basically was either on a mainframe computer. We didn't have personal computers in the early 80s. I'm dating myself. But we really did have personal computers, and everything was on mainframe computers or mini computers. So life was pretty good because you could write test scripts and they were somewhat contained. And, the infrastructure didn't really change that much. Fast forward to 2019, and there's a whole world of difference. You have mobile technologies that basically exist in the cloud, the infrastructure for them. You have cloud technologies where the infrastructure like Microsoft Azure and some of the core infrastructure that supports the cloud changes daily. And so one of the tenets of validation is change control. So how do you deal with all of that? And then the last trend is the FDA is releasing new guidance, and they're even changing the name of validation from validation to software assurance. And it's with a less emphasis on preparing the reams of documents that we're used to and more emphasis on risk-based testing. So there's a lot changing, Stacey, in the world of validation.
My goodness. Right. So, and it's true. And you mentioned mobility and automation, two of the biggest influencers right now, I would say, and it sounds like you would say too, in across the industry. And we see it impacting all the way down to the patient level, right? Because the patients also have their mobile devices. They're trying to access not just their medical records, but there's automation in some of the medical devices that people are using in their homes, and they're going out to the internet from their computers or from their mobile phones to report data back to their physicians, et cetera. So we see it really affecting not just the industry production wise, but the patients. Mm-hmm. What do you see with all of these things in mind? What do you see as the greatest obstacles to a full integration of all of these technologies for pharma companies over the next, let's say, 12 months? What should we expect to see?
Well, one of the biggest obstacles for realizing the, kind of Pharma 4.0 vision is change. Mm-hmm. We've always done it this way, right? But there's another big obstacle, and I think Microsoft's CEO is really kind of addressing that. If you take a look at where technology has evolved, looking at a typical pharma company, say an Abbott Labs or a Merck, many of these companies have disparate technologies that don't really talk to each other, don't really interoperate. Many of these technologies were not designed to work together. And when you have technologies and you're bringing them into a highly regulated process that can impact patients. And right. The thing that you said, Stacey, is so important. Now we're getting into systems that do impact patients. Patients are wearing medical devices on different parts of their body to actually track and manage disease states in their body. So how do you deal with these different types of systems? And one of the things that Microsoft is doing is they're normalizing a lot of their technology. They're bringing them together in a truly integrated fashion so that, your SharePoint database talks to Microsoft Dynamics 365, for example, and D365 talks to your CRM, and then it talks to your mobile devices, the Internet of Things, and so forth. So it's a broader strategy, and Microsoft's one of the only companies that's actually doing this right now in real time. They're bringing together all of the assets together that a company would need and harmonizing the technology so that they are designed to work together. I think that's, one of the, biggest things that companies can look at is bringing together harmonized systems. The second biggest obstacle is paper. When you look at what's going on in 2019, many companies are still working through paper-based processes. This is actually, causing a bit of havoc because when you look at all of the different technologies and then you start thinking, well, ultimately what we're doing is working on paper. That's a big thing. And then another barrier to automation is really money. Because a lot of companies do not want to pay for compliance. Compliance is considered a necessary evil in some cases, and people don't want to do that. They don't want to pay for it. We used to say back in the old days, back in the 80s, that automation was looked at as a luxury. Today, given all of the things that you mentioned, Stacey, artificial intelligence, robotics, Internet of Things, mobility, all of those, automation is not a luxury anymore. It's a necessity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is one that is reliant heavily on, because we do have the cloud, because we have cloud technology, we have the ability to store so much more data in real time. And going back to what you said at the very beginning of our conversation about cybersecurity, I'm wondering, for these pharmaceutical companies and manufacturers, et cetera, whether they're doing research or they're in production, what they're obviously dealing with very confidential data, requires high security. So cybersecurity is not just a computer issue. It's an issue of data security at its very core. But keeping in mind that cost is an issue, as you just mentioned, and a lot of these pharmaceutical companies are price sensitive.
Exactly.
How do they then choose between one of these, cloud systems, whether it's an on-site server that they're investing in, a private cloud account, or some one of these public cloud options that we hear so much about? Do you have any experience with that?
Yes, indeed, I do. A lot of my clients are moving to the cloud. If you were to ask me 5 or 6 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, I would say that most of the life sciences companies that I work with were on premise in terms of their deployment strategies. More and more and more people are moving very sensitive data to the cloud. Right. All cloud providers are not created equally. There are some, yes, indeed. There are some cloud providers who understand the regulatory nature of the environment that they are going to be serving their clients. And then there are some cloud providers who just have no clue of the demands that a life sciences company is really facing. There are several things that I would recommend for companies who are continuing to deploy solutions in the cloud. Number one, if you're going to acquire cloud technology, you need to, just as with everything else, have a standard operating procedure for cloud governance. Just like you would never purchase raw materials without having an SOP that says this is what we will do and this is how we will accept it, you should never accept cloud technology without having a strategy and governance around managing your cloud providers. The second thing, you need to have a supplier qualification for cloud vendors. I don't know how many times I've received a vendor certification or a supplier qualification. And as a cloud vendor, it never asked me anything about the cloud. It asked me everything else, even things that are not relevant to me. When you look at cloud providers, you need to look at them for their audit assurance and compliance, application interface security, business continuity, and operational resilience. How easy is it for them to come back if there is an issue with your data? What is their data integrity strategy, the security of the data, the infrastructure and virtualization? You need to understand that. So there are many things about cloud providers. I would say let the buyer beware. Caveat emptor, you need to really be careful when you select cloud vendors. They're all not created equal.
And so would you say is this different, or is it exactly the same as how we treat all other vendors?
It's pretty much the same as how you treat all other vendors, Stacey. You're right. But I find, and this is interesting, in my practice, there are many companies, when I ask the question, when I go inside, do you have a cloud standard operating procedure? They kind of look at me and go, cloud? No. A lot of companies, Stacey, don't have them. And the same thing with cybersecurity. I've been telling all my clients, Stacey, get a cybersecurity SOP. And for those who are listening, if you don't have one, reach out to me. I'll give you one. No charge,
right.
Because it's a very, very important thing to have. You need to have governance and a structure around how you select and qualify cloud vendors for use in your company. And I can tell you this, if you don't have it, the FDA will certainly be asking you about that.
Oh, for sure.
Yes.
And that's talk about fear.
That's
when the old audits come happening, then we're so. But I do think it's funny. It's a little bit ironic because a lot of pharmaceutical companies traditionally have had SOPs for everything they do, and so Absolutely. Why would it be so much different for their cybersecurity plan or their cloud plan. So I totally agree. And thank you for offering to assist people with that, because
absolutely.
I wonder if that's just something that, because they're not able to yet embrace these new things as they come in, right? We're a little bit slow moving, our industry.
Exactly.
But it's as to your point, it's a necessity now. And
absolutely.
So
absolutely.
Forward we shall go.
Right. Exactly.
And staying with the cybersecurity for another minute and touching back on automation, which we started our conversation with, it seems to me that this is very important to automated testing and the whole automated process because of the volume of data being collected and then used in machine learning, right? Which these are all things that are part of this next revolution. So what does this mean for cybersecurity or CSV teams within organizations? Is it going to change the way that they're operating in the life science space?
You bet it is. These teams have to be well versed. They have to have in-depth knowledge of regulations and laws governing data. For example, recently, the United Kingdom published the GDPR regulation, for data privacy.
Right.
You're starting to get more feedback from companies regarding how you comply with data integrity standards, data privacy standards, and so forth. The validation engineer and those who are involved in validation have to be more well-versed in these areas. You have to really go beyond thinking about traditional validation. And pretty much, Stacey, I'll share with you, I've kind of thrown the book out a little bit on the old ways that we do validation. And I think the FDA is doing that too. They're saying, the FDA used to require like reams and reams of documents, and it was about how much documentation you produced, whether or not your system was validated. Yeah, the more the better, or by the pound, if you will, as some people say. And now the FDA is really focused more on risk-based testing. And when I say I've kind of thrown out the rule book, I'm looking at how can I do my job faster, which is what my clients demand, but how can I assure compliance? And validation engineers have to look at issues concerning data privacy and protection. They have to deal with data integrity issues. They have to deal with big data issues. They have to deal with the protection of this data throughout regulatory retention periods as established by predicate rule requirements that say how long you have to keep certain data. They have to go much beyond the technology. And I think that's where the biggest change is going to come.
Okay, that does make sense for sure. And so as we think about all of these newer technologies and new processes coming into a traditional industry, there's going to have to be some give and take, and there's going to have to be a lot of planning, of course. What, in your mind, does a real integrated solution look like here? And maybe some first steps that some industry leaders can take to start to move in the right direction if they're not yet fully on board with all of these changes.
Absolutely. And I'll share it with you this way. When I used to work for Abbott years ago, I had about 16 different systems that supported my validation effort. I had a document management system over here. I had another requirements management system over here. I had one that, was a laboratory information system over here. I had different pieces of it. I had, I didn't really have an automated testing tool, but I had tools that would allow me to, capture objective evidence, whether I was doing process automation or computer systems automation. Really, today's goal is bringing all of these technologies together in a harmonized environment. Mm-hmm. So going from a fragmented technology infrastructure to a harmonized infrastructure that allows you to, basically validate any type of system and bring all of your technology assets really together in one regulatory house, if you will. So that's what I think it looks, the future looks like from a technology infrastructure piece. Your technology has to communicate, the pieces together, have to communicate together. So when you look at that, that's what we need to do. What we need to focus on is greater emphasis on testing and less emphasis on stressing over the documentation. And I think this is where the FDA is really trying to drive the industry. If you look at your tax return, for example, they talk about the least burdensome approach. Right. I think that's where the FDA is going with validation, taking the least burdensome approach. Finally, in order to really deal with any of these technologies, whether it be robotics, AI, mobility, and that kind of thing, companies are going to have to get a grip on automation. Automation is no longer a luxury. It is a necessity. If you want to harness the power of these tools and be able to use them effectively to drive regulated processes and data across your organization, you have to automate. That's one of the things. And there are many different types of systems out there, some better than others that would facilitate that. But I would strongly encourage people to start looking at enterprise validation management and quality systems that really kind of drive these regulated processes.
Yeah, I agree. And I think from everything I've read that these systems, when you choose the right system and are able to fully integrate automation, your process is safer,
absolutely,
faster, and less expensive.
And consistent, which is the bedrock of quality.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it really is a winning scenario if you can move as a company.
Absolutely.
Towards that end. Absolutely. So, before we end, I know we have a lot to think about here as we get more and more technologies and it moves faster and faster. But as we move closer to fully automated systems and practices, what one parting thought would you like to leave our listeners with, Valarie?
I would say, come on in, the water's fine. Automation is really here to stay, but I would like to share with our listeners, it's not as hard as you think. Technology is far more advanced than it was in the 80s and the 90s, and we've come a long way from the old days of mainframe computers and mini computers to client server technology to now more advanced cloud and mobile technology. In order to keep up with the pace of change, technology is changing at the speed of thought. And in order for companies to keep up, you really have to consider automation as one of those tools in your toolbox to help you do your job. Come on in, the water's fine. Automation is not as hard as you think. Everything starts with the plan and the strategy. There are many resources out there to help you plan and strategize, but I would say this to you. If you want to continue success in this industry, ensure data integrity and compliance. Automation is the key to your success.
Very well said, Valarie. Thank you so much for that.
You are very, very welcome.
End on that brilliant note today.
All right. Well, it's been good to be with you, Stacey.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Valarie King-Bailey. Also want to give a shout out to my producer, Ed Sullivan, and Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe in your podcast player of choice and share with your friends and colleagues. That's how people are going to learn about us. You can find out more by visiting ivtnetwork.com. And I look forward to you visiting us during another great episode coming up next week. Until then, Thank you and enjoy your day.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.